Week 12 of the fantasy football season is over and a lot just happened. So in this video, we will be breaking down the 10 players that you need to be adding based on what just happened in week 11. And we got to start with this backfield. Maybe one of the grossest backfields in all of football, but it's the Raiders backfield because a lot just happened in this backfield this past weekend. First off, let's start with the usage over at PFF. Look at this right here. All three running backs, Amir Abdullah, an older veteran, Zamir White, who we thought was the RB1 coming into the season, and Alexander Mattison. All of these guys, if you look at this first row right here, these are the snap counts. They're basically splitting the backfield, 22 snaps, 22, and 20 snaps. But there is a pretty key reason for this. Zamir White left this game with a quad injury, and as far as I am concerned, he did not return to this game. And then also Alexander Mattison left with an ankle injury, but he was actually ruled out from this game. So it seems like his ankle injury is more severe than what Zamir White was dealing with. Zamir White was never actually ruled out. There was always a chance that he can come back in. Mattison, they were like, nope, no, that's a bad injury. You're done. We'll see if it's a high ankle sprain. If so, he might miss multiple weeks. We still don't have news on that as of this recording. So now this is an interesting situation because if Mattison misses time and Zamir White was to play, all of a sudden Zamir White goes back to being the guy we thought he was at the beginning of the year when he was seeing 63% of the snaps in this backfield, multiple games of 10 plus opportunities, right? And then all of a sudden Zamir White starts to not play as well. They start to give more usage to Mattison. Zamir White fumbles and you start to get no usage out of White, 13% of the snaps, 3%. We saw a little bit more usage in week 9 before the bye. He had 6 carries, 3 red zone carries. That was his most usage in basically a month of the season. So there was kind of this small, like, okay, maybe it's a trend in the right direction for Zamir White, or maybe it's just, a small sample of 6 carries. But now it seems like Zamir White is trending up. But if Zamir White was also to miss time, since he now has a quad injury as well, we'll have to track the injury reports. Amir Abdullah, at least based on this past game, would be the next man up. Now, he only had 4 touches in this game. These running backs got hurt later on in the game. He did score a receiving touchdown. That's kind of the role of Amir Abdullah if we were to go to him. Like, this is an older running back. He's 31 and a half years old. He is known as a guy in his career that was kind of built off of speed, about a 205-pound back, or built off of agility and burst more so, as you can see right here. Player profiler, 99th percentile in burst, both of those. And then for the most part of his career, the last couple of years with the Raiders, he's basically been a special teams player, a special teams captain, somebody that they like having on the roster. But he's not necessarily going to be the guy who takes on a full workload because we've really never seen that in his career outside of like the preseason years ago. Which, if indeed Mattison and Zamir White were to miss time, I do think Amir Abdullah sees more work, but I think that Dylan Lobb, their late round rookie, could be the guy. Lobb, I think he could be the guy that actually starts to see more work moving forward, and maybe the early down work as the guy who gets 10 to 15 touches. Now, if you're not familiar with Dylan Lobb, he is a late round, 6th round pick for them. He's an exciting player for people to talk about in dynasty circles because he's an elite pass catcher. He averaged 5.3 receptions per game his final 2 years of college, including 7 catches per game in 2023. Both of those metrics led the nation amongst running backs. In fact, look at this right here. This is a running back. In his game against Central Michigan, he had 12 receptions, 295 receiving yards, not even factoring in his rushing production, 2 touchdowns, averaged nearly 25 yards per reception. Obviously, this was the best game of his career. I'm pointing it out because it's insanely impressive for a running back to do, but he had many of games in his career where he was going for 70 to 100 plus receiving yards. And he was a productive player in college on the ground as well. You can see right here, it was a smaller school at New Hampshire where he was producing, but he had a 1,300-yard season, and then in 2 less games, he had 800 yards. But again, if you come over to the receptions, this is the name of the game for this dude. Literally was like a wide receiver, 49 and a 68 catch season, nearly 700 receiving yards. So yeah, this guy has a lot of upside in fantasy if he's actually out there a lot, because the Raiders will be trailing in games, and if he's out there on early downs because he's a talented running back, and then he's out there on passing downs, on 3rd downs, you might get even more check downs. That's where some upside comes in if White and Mattison were to miss time. Now, if you look at the upcoming schedule, it is brutal. They're at home against the Broncos, a tough run defense. Then they go to the Chiefs, probably the toughest run defense in the league. But if this was a longer term injury for Mattison and Lobb was able to get on the field and show that he's a productive player, then the fantasy playoff schedule against the Bucks, against the Falcons, against the Jags and Saints, I mean, that is as good of a playoff schedule as you will find. So we have to track the news here. If Mattison ends up being a high ankle, that could be a month, and then it's just Zamir White, who they already have shown they don't believe in, versus like Dylan Lobb. I think it's worth a speculative ad right now on Lobb. And you could also pick up Amir Abdullah and or Zamir White just to see what happens with the injury reports the next few days. Now, the next man we have to talk about here is Jonnu Smith, whose big season just continues right now. Look at this. Honestly, this might have been the most encouraging thing we've seen. This is just the PFF snaps, routes run. You can see all this in targets. If you go to the bottom right here, Jonnu Smith ran 35 routes this past week for Miami. That led the team. That was more than Tyreek, more than Waddle. He was out there the most out of any player and ended up leading to 7 targets for him, which was a huge game once again. 30 plus fantasy points. He was the tight end 3 on the week. This is the second time in the past 5 games that he's finished as a top 3 tight end. He's had explosive plays in there, 100 yards, 2 different touchdowns in this one in a nice matchup against the Raiders. And now when we have the bye weeks coming up next week and plenty of teams are on bye, you're going to notice that in a lot of your fantasy leagues. Like, I don't even have a roster this week. Jonnu Smith's available in over 50% of leagues. He plays next week in a good matchup, worth an ad. And this is a guy who, it's not just like a 1 week thing for him. Like, you can look back now, back to week 5 here. 7 targets, 7, 6. These are with different quarterbacks, by the way. Now Tua is, of course, back, and he just had his best game of the year with Tua, so that's good. 6 targets and 4. So now, since he had 7 targets this past week, he's now had at least 6 targets, 6 to 7 targets, in 5 of his last 6 games. That is something only 6 other tight ends have done during that time, averaged about 7 targets per contest. And I thought this stat was interesting when I was doing some of my research here by Marissa. You can see 10 games into the season, Jonnu Smith has 448 receiving yards. Nothing crazy, but for the tight end position, when you're competing against Waddle, Tyreek, and Devon Achane, pretty good. But this is the important part. Last season, the total yards by all tight ends for the Dolphins was 412. They had no tight ends last season. They weren't getting them involved. They wanted to get them involved. They just only had like Durham Smythe, nobody that was impressive. Jonnu Smith is a very impressive and efficient and productive player. I mean, he's always been known for his yards per route run, even with Atlanta, even with the Titans in the past, the Patriots to an extent, although he wasn't used that much there. 11th entering the week in yards per route run. Now he'll be top 10 in that metric. He also entered the week 12th in yards after the catch. He will definitely be top 10 in that metric as well because of this play right here. Now, this play is a little bit of, it's a little fugazi because it's somewhat of a broken play, but he ends up getting open and he runs for about 40 yards after the catch, so that's going to increase his overall totalage. But we've also seen this guy have other huge plays just a week or 2 ago as well. Matchup against the Rams. He yards after the catch screen, ends up finding the end zone, breaking multiple tackles. This is a talented player now actually getting a lot of usage. And as I mentioned, the schedule, look, next week he's going to face the Patriots at home. I mean, that's a great schedule. That defense has not been good all year. Then after that, you could say what you want to say. The matchup on Thanksgiving, if you want to watch him play there, you can as well. And you can just see what happens here. He's coming off of his best game of the season. He continues to see a lot of volume. He's clearly game planned into this offense. His other touchdown was at the red zone, a play designed for him. So matchup against the Patriots this week, we take it from there. We pick him up, we play him if you need to, and then we see what happens. Now, before we get into our next running back, who surprisingly saw a lot of good usage this past week, I got to quickly let you know about something pretty exciting, and it's our new Fantasy Blueprint sponsor, Vivid Picks. Because if you like fantasy sports or making predictions, really the combination of those two things, like I do, well, then this app is for you right here, predicting the game into a game of its own. And with Vivid Picks, they make it extremely easy to get in on the action, especially during this time of the year where some of your fantasy teams might just be out of it. All you have to do is pick players, make predictions, and then watch the games as they unfold. It's pretty simple. They have multiple game modes, they're versus, they're more or less. I personally like the more or less the best because I feel like that correlates the best to fantasy. I know I can put some of my knowledge there to the test. And here's an example of that right now. Depending on when you're watching this, this is for Monday Night Football in Week 11, the Cowboys and the Texans, but you can use this for any game moving forward, Thursday Night Football, and of course the Sunday slate and other sports as well. You can see right here, I took a more or less. I ended up taking less CJ Stroud touchdown passes in this one, even with Nico Collins back. This is a run-heavy team in the red zone. Nico Collins is back over his receiving yards, averaging 113 yards per game so far this year. I took Jalen Tolbert's over receiving yards. I'm not really the biggest on the player, but CeeDee Lamb is still banged up, and that's a low total for your number 2. And Rico Dotto over 20.5 receiving yards. Mike McCarthy just said he's going to get more involved. I think they trail by 7 is the spread in this one. If they're going to be trailing, more checkdowns to the running backs makes sense. So I took these 4 picks together on Vivid Picks. You can take those, you can tail those, or whatever other picks you want to as well. And the exciting thing is, if you're a new member to Vivid Picks, they'll actually offer you a bonus of up to $100 on your first deposit. So if you put in 20, you get 20 back. If you put in 100, you get 100 back. So if you're ready to start making those predictions, download the Vivid Picks app now and use code SAL so you can get your first deposit matched up to $100 and you can begin dominating today. So a big thank you to Vivid Picks, our Fantasy Blueprint sponsor. Now let's get back to the video. Now that running back I was talking about who saw some surprisingly good usage was actually Cam Akers. He's been seeing more and more usage since he joined the Vikings as their now clear RB2, but this past week, 27 snaps compared to just 39 for Aaron Jones. We scroll over to the usage, 15 carries according to PFF for Aaron Jones and 10 for Cam Akers. So this was a pretty close spread. Now, of course, Aaron Jones came into this game banged up. He got carted off the field last week. They said it was just because it was easier to get to the locker room, but he had a rib injury, so heading into this week, he was kind of, up in the air if he was going to play. Now, he ended up playing, but it seems like he was limited, but maybe they're also just trying to purposely limit him because he's left already 4 games early this season due to injuries. Now, you can see right here, in a tough matchup against Tennessee, 12 total touches for 36 yards. Now, that's not great, 3 yards per touch. He does find the end zone. He gets you nearly 12 fantasy points. Cam Akers is the guy who all season long, whether it was with the Texans filling in for Joe Mixon, he hasn't been the most efficient or productive back. And now with Christian Darrisaw done for the season for the Vikings, well, now they kind of have some struggles blocking for the run. But I guess my biggest takeaway here is that we can feel pretty secure right now that Cam Akers, in what is still a solid offense in Minnesota, we saw that this past week as Sam Darnold bounced back, he's the clear RB2 ahead of Ty Chandler right now, and it's not even close. Cam Akers sees 27 snaps in this game, after they ended up acquiring him before the trade deadline. He's been playing more than Ty Chandler, and the biggest disparity in that is right here. Cam Akers, 27 snaps compared to just 1 for Ty Chandler. So I guess what I'm trying to say is he's the guy that you want to be holding on to and probably handcuffing at this point heading into the fantasy postseason if you're a Fantasy Jones manager. I don't know if I called him a Fantasy Jones manager, but an Aaron Jones fantasy manager. And also it's worth pointing out that the matchups coming up, like the matchup against the Bears on the road, it's going to scare a lot of people, but this Bears team, especially with all the bye weeks, if you're just trying to find a flex option that's going to see 10 touches like Akers did this past week just to get by for the week, it could be, somebody who's viable. The Bears just gave up this massive performance to Josh Jacobs of over 130 total yards and a touchdown on 22 touches. The Bears allowed the 5th most rushing yards per game. It wasn't even just Josh Jacobs. Like Emmanuel Sanders on his 2 carries, he had a 13-yard run in there, a 4-yard run. Like anybody was getting theirs against the Bears in this matchup. And really for the better part of the season, you can run on the Bears. The next man we got to talk about, it takes us over to the Cleveland Browns. Elijah Moore, we've been talking about him weekly, but he's still available in over 80% of fantasy leagues despite his high volume continuing. How high is the volume right now? Well, according to Ryan Heath of Fantasy Points right here, since Jameis Winston took over the past 3 games, Elijah Moore is averaging 9.3 targets per game. That would rank as the wide receiver 5 in terms of volume in all of fantasy. A top 5 fantasy volume the past month of the season for Elijah Moore, yet he's on the waiver wires in over 80% of leagues. I don't understand. And I get it, like the previous week he wasn't producing, now he comes out of the bye week, immediately produces, catches 6 of his 8 targets, 66 yards and a touchdown. A nice matchup against New Orleans for sure. 18.6 fantasy points he puts up in this one, and now things are starting to look really good for this guy. He's really starting to look like a player who you can rely on as a flex option, especially with the bye weeks coming up. And the whole knock on Elijah Moore in the past was, well, one, his quarterback situation stunk. He kind of hurt himself as well, kind of just making noise that he didn't have to with the Jets, but his role there in those other offenses, short yardage, not downfield, that hasn't been the case with Jameis Winston. He's seeing volume downfield, like you can see right here in this pass where Jameis Winston escapes the pockets, 30 yards downfield in the end zone, toe tap, touchdown for Elijah Moore. Beautiful catch in general, but Elijah Moore, if he was on the Jets, if this was the Browns last year, Elijah Moore isn't getting downfield nearly as much. In this game, not only that 30-yard touchdown, but he had 2 other targets that were registered as deep targets of at least 15 yards downfield. And this is all very important to point out because this team is just throwing so much with Jameis Winston in his 3 starts. As you can see right here, 41 pass attempts, 46 pass attempts, and 46 pass attempts. The guy is averaging 43 pass attempts per game right now. That leads the NFL over the past month of the season. That's going to lead to a lot of overall production for your wide receivers, like we're seeing. Now, of course, the schedule is really tough moving forward here. You can see they play on a short week this week at home against the Steelers. Then they have to face the Broncos, good secondary. Steelers again, the Chiefs, solid defense, right? This is a very tough schedule, but if they're going to be playing from behind in these games, and we've already seen them want to throw the ball, 40 plus pass attempts against any team means a lot of volume for the wide receivers, and it will lead to some big plays like we saw this past week for Elijah Moore. He's worth an ad. The next situation takes us to the Atlanta Falcons with this one right here. Darnell Mooney injured his hamstring in this game, I believe in the second half. He was questionable to return, as you can see right here. He never ended up returning. This is a concern because hamstring injuries, especially for wide receivers, if they force you out of a game and keep you out of a game, odds are it's severe enough that it's going to be at least a mild hamstring, which usually takes some time to recover from. How much time does it take? Well, we can point to a sports MD analysis here, a Harvard-trained sports surgeon. He says Darnell Mooney average hamstring today. The average return is 2 weeks. He also had a mild Achilles strain coming into the week, which is definitely a concern. They have a week 12 bye, as you can see right here. So the team, we're not going to see them play again until week 13 at home against the Chargers. But even in that matchup against the Chargers, and we just saw the Bengals play very well. Joe Burrow threw 50 times against the Chargers. I shouldn't say very well, but enough to have fantasy production for Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. In this matchup against the Chargers, there's a risk that Darnell Mooney is not out there, so who is going to be the replacement? Well, that's where Ray McLoud comes in, and it's kind of tough with the Falcons going on bye and there being a lot of bye weeks in general to be picking up a guy who's not going to be starting for you in week 12, but if you can kind of manage to get by in week 12 without McLeod, he's an interesting player because of the nice week 13 and even week 14 matchup if Mooney was to miss more time. McLeod is somebody who, believe it or not, actually led this team by far in snaps. He led this team in routes, and he earned 6 targets, which again led this team in week 11. And he's been a player who's been, somewhat productive this season, depending on your expectations. This past week in a tough matchup, 6 catches for 46 yards, catches all of his targets, mostly a short area guy, started to play a little bit more on the outside when Mooney went out in this game. And now if you were to look at his game logs here in terms of like flex appeal for you, if that's what you're looking for, especially in like weeks 13 when he comes back, 9 or more fantasy points in one, there's 2 here, there's 12.5 there, there's 12.5 here, so that's 4 games, and this past week he had 10. So in half of his games this year, he's giving you a flex-worthy performance, somebody that we should at least worth mentioning because Darnell Mooney could be missing extended time. The other situation we got to mention is this Patriots wide receiver room, because I think we have to discuss the room at this point because this offense does look pretty strong under Drake May once again this past week. So what's going on in the wide receiver room? Well, their starting wide receivers were Kayshon Boutte, once again, leading the team in snaps and routes run by far, 45 routes. Nobody else hits 30 in the wide receiver receiver room, and this led to 6 targets. I believe he's now seen 6 or more targets in 4 straight games. The other piece here, DeAndre Douglas, kind of a staple in this offense now, running out of the slot, 29 routes, 7 targets, led this team. These 7 targets end up going for about 10.9 fantasy points, 5 catches, 59 yards. It's kind of rinse and repeat with DeAndre Douglas. He's operating out of the slot. He should probably be on the field for more than 50% of the snaps, but it's just not happening right now. But then the most interesting piece for me here was Kendrick Bourne, a guy who played 0 snaps last week. Seemed like he was benched or something for some reason. He comes out, he runs 23 routes, operates as the number 2 outside receiver in this game, and he puts up the most fantasy production. Catches all 5 of his targets for 70 yards and a touchdown, 18 fantasy points. This is a guy, Kendrick Bourne, who for the most part has been like a hit or miss player the last couple of years of his career. He's coming off of a torn ACL. He's still just 29 years old. It feels like he's like 30 or 31, but he's coming off of that torn ACL. But this is a guy in the past who he has been productive, especially downfield, with much worse quarterbacks in his career. 800-yard season, 700-yard season. Then he battled injuries in 2023, so you can't really hold that against him. Now he has maybe the best quarterback of his entire career, or at least over the past 4 years or so, and I think there's some upside here. There's a lot of volatility. He might not play at all next week, but I think there's some upside to him specifically as a veteran working downfield with Drake May. It's also worth pointing out that the actual target leader on this team, seeing 9 targets, catching 6 of them for 63 yards, was Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry, who is available right now in about 55% of fantasy leagues with all the bye weeks coming up next week. He seems like he's been the most stable part of this offense and the most stable piece for Drake May, somebody that I'd definitely be looking to add if you need a tight end, and Jonnu Smith is already gone. But again, the reason why all of this works right now is because of Drake May. In this game, completes 30 or 40 passes. 75% of his passes despite being under pressure nonstop. He ends up totaling with his rushing yards about over 300 yards in this game, multiple touchdown passes. He's just sustaining drives. We've talked about it before. He's sustaining drives. They're getting to the red zone. It's leading to touchdown opportunities. It's leading to more receptions, targets, and carries for the entire offense. When you're sustaining drives and not going 3 and out often, everybody gets a lift. That's what's happening here. So it's worth breaking down this wide receiver room. My order right now on adding these guys, we kind of know what DeAndre Douglas is at this point. If you kind of need like 7 to 12 fantasy points, fine, go for him. But I'll actually end up adding first here Kendrick Bourne, just to see what happens, just to see if the role grows a little bit more, because I do think he's their best player downfield. Kayshon Boutte, he's getting 6 targets a game. He's not just, I just don't think he's that talented of a player right now. Of course, that can change. He's a younger player. So I would go Kendrick Bourne, DeAndre Douglas, and Kayshon Boutte if you needed a flex option this upcoming week. Now let's break down another wide receiver room that's even grosser than the one we just discussed somehow. And this wide receiver room would be the Saints wide receiver room. And the reason why, oh my God, the Saints wide receiver room, gross. It's only Taysom Hill there. Look, listen, the reason we have to break this down is look at the upcoming schedule for the Saints. Just give me a second and look at this here. They go on bye this week. After they come out of the bye week, the Rams, bottom 10 secondary. The Giants, average secondary at best. The Commanders, bottom 10 secondary. The Packers, averaged. You get the Raiders, and then you get the Bucks in the fantasy postseason, which is probably the best schedule you will find in those 2 weeks, or right up there as a top 5 schedule. So we have to break it down. We have to see what they have here. And honestly, they don't have much because of Rashid Shaheed done for the year. Chris Olave on IR. Who knows if he plays again if this team isn't competing. Bub Means is still on IR. So their top 3 wide receivers are completely done. So who is left out there? Well, we saw a young player, a wide receiver, Calvin Austin, make his second start, former Notre Dame player, former USFL player for the Birmingham Stallions. He sees just 2 targets for 18 yards. We see MVS off of his big week last week, by far being the leading receiver here, running 26 routes. Nobody else ran more than 16 routes right here. MVS ends up turning this usage once again. Not a lot of volume here. 3 targets last week, 4 targets this week, but he finds a deep touchdown in there. These deep touchdowns will not be sustainable, but 16.7 fantasy points. That's going to make MVS a very popular ad once again, like he was last week. But again, he's not going to continue to have 70-yard touchdowns every single week, right? This is a very short week sample where he's been great, but it's not sustainable production. We're seeing no production underneath. We're seeing no heavy volume. Not somebody I'm interested in adding. The one piece here, if I had to choose, that is interesting is Cedric Wilson, which seems kind of crazy because he only played 10 snaps. He only ran 5 routes. He saw absolutely 0 targets and got you 0 fantasy points. But this was a guy returning from an injury. He was clearly limited in this game. I want to see him after the bye week ramped up, and I think he could operate as the number 1 receiver while Olave remains out. Because we kind of saw that. We saw that, right? He had a 17.7 fantasy point day, and then in week 9, before getting injured, he was off to a nice start, 2 catches for 34 yards. Then he ends up getting injured. He was operating as the number 1 receiver. And the other piece to point out here is that Mason Tippmann, another rookie on this team, a fast rookie, an undrafted free agent, he was a healthy scratch. He was ranked top 5, or he was ranked number 1 on this team, according to PFF, in routes run over the past month of the season due to all the injuries. And then he was just a healthy scratch because he hasn't been producing, because he hasn't been getting open. So the three guys that I just mentioned for you right there, and Kelvin Austin, MVS, and Cedric Wilson, probably the top 3 receivers moving forward, and I think Wilson is the most talented of those guys. So again, this is a gross wide receiver room. They're going on bye week, so don't spend any priority budget, but if you're in a deeper league, I would stash Wilson and see what happens after the bye week. Wouldn't be shocked if he starts to come out, play 70% of the routes, and be a guy who's getting like 5 catches, 50 yards, and you hope for a touchdown. Now, before we get into this next running back that you should be considering adding, hey, we're at the point in the video, the gentleman's agreement. Just hit that subscribe button if you find this video helpful, engaging, entertaining, whatever it might be. These videos take like 6 to 8 hours each to put together for all you beautiful people. All I ask for in return is to hit the subscribe button, let you see my future content, allows the channel to grow and for others to find it. So, gentleman's agreement, we shake on it, 2 seconds, hit that subscribe button. Next man up is a running back for the Browns. We talked about a receiver in Elijah Moore. Now we have to talk about a running back because Jerome Ford is quietly playing a lot these past few weeks. Because this past week in week 11, Jerome Ford goes out there, he plays 41 snaps compared to just 22 for Nick Chubb. You scroll over to the usage. Okay, Chubb sees 11 carries, was averaging nearly 5 yards per carry. He looked pretty good in this game, a couple of decent runs. And then 9 opportunities though, 5 carries and 4 targets in this one for Jerome Ford. So they basically split the backfield opportunities near 50-50. Now a lot of this had to do with the game script. The Browns got down in this game basically the entire time by 7. Later in the game, they were down by 14. So they had to get to the guy who is more of a pass catching threat in Jerome Ford. Now what that led to, and as it has for most of the season for Jerome Ford, was not a massive performance. Like he ends up seeing 9 overall opportunities, 39 total yards. He gets lifted up in PPR formats because of his 4 catches. But look, this is a guy that this is going to continue to happen for, because look at the schedule for the Browns. As we discussed it earlier for Elijah Moore, short week here against the Steelers. Tough matchup, they might be trailing. Against the Broncos, they might be trailing with how good that offense looks. Definitely against the Chiefs. Like moving forward, there's a lot of situations where Jerome Ford might have to get on the field more in the second half as the Browns play from behind. And the Browns are throwing 40 plus times a game, as we mentioned with Jameis Winston. So you could still continue to see these 3 to 4 to 5 reception games for Jerome Ford, get you through some of these massive bye weeks in week 12 and 14 coming up. Now I have to bring up Bo Nix, somehow still available in 50% of fantasy leagues. I just traded for him before this past week, ended up working out really well after his career game of a top 3 fantasy finish, 30 fantasy points, completes in this game 85% of his passes, 307 yards, 4 touchdowns, was making some legit throws in this one. The offense in general looked great. He had a couple of screen pass touchdowns, so his wide receivers helped him out, of course, is there as well. And in this game, he only had 2 carries for 5 yards. Didn't even get his legs going, which is definitely a dimension of his game. This is a top 10 quarterback rest of season. He's been a top 10 quarterback in fantasy since week 4. Go at him. And oh yeah, by the way, the schedule against the Raiders, his toughest matchup over the next, I don't know, 6 weeks, 5 weeks, you can say, is this matchup against the Browns. But after that, the Raiders, the Colts, the Chargers, who didn't look all that great this past game on Sunday night, and then the Bengals, those are some really nice spots. We should also talk about Roshan Johnson because look, the Bears had a new play caller this past week, and based on the usage that we saw for Roshan Johnson, as you can see right here, sees 30 snaps, which is about 42% compared to just 41 for DeAndre Swift. Goes over here, sees 10 carries and 1 target compared to 14 carries for DeAndre Swift. Like Swift was still the lead back in this backfield. Swift was the guy who was breaking off the 30+ yard touchdown, but it was Roshan Johnson whose role increased the most here with the new play caller. And that led to Johnson seeing 11 touches for 41 yards. Okay, so about 4 yards per touch. That's fine. He gets the go-ahead touchdown at the goal line ahead of DeAndre Swift. They trusted Roshan Johnson more here, and I think moving forward, we might see more of Roshan. Roshan, who is arguably a better pass catcher than DeAndre Swift, definitely a better pass protector, and somebody who can run between the tackles. So interesting here. I think this is good usage that can trend in the right direction with a new play caller. Add it. And the final guy I'll talk about is a wide receiver for Bo Nix, a wide receiver in Devon Vele, a 7th-round rookie for them who's been honestly very strong, operating as a number 2. Nice size at 6 foot, 203 pounds. You scroll over here, the athletic testing is also very good according to Player Profiler. 86th percentile speed, 73rd percentile catch radius, above average burst. All these things are great to see. And then you look at the usage. Obviously, Courtland Sutton's the number 1 wide receiver on this team, but Devon Vele, when healthy this season, has operated as the clear number 2. 42 snaps, 15 more than any other receiver not named Sutton. 26 routes run, nearly double any other receiver not named Courtland Sutton. It leads to 4 targets in this game. And if you watch the broadcast, if you watch the games in general this year for Devon Vele, you watch his film, Bo Nix consistently targets this guy, a big-bodied receiver, in key situations on 3rd and 4th down. This led to another nice showing this past week where he caught 4 balls for 66 yards in this game as well. He was big on 3rd down with 2 third down receptions, 10 fantasy points. Again, I bring up names like this because we're at the point in the season where week 12, there's a ton of teams on bye. If you need a filler in a nice matchup on an offense and a quarterback that is ascending right now, Devon Vele is worth a look. So these have been the players that you should be adding before week 12 begins. Now, we're going to talk about some stashes. The trade season is over in fantasy. Most of the deadlines have passed. But if you want to see the running backs and wide receivers to stash, well, stay tuned to this channel later in the week. When those videos drop, they will pop up right here. So, beautiful people, I appreciate you all tuning in. Check out our sponsor for the Fantasy Blueprint, Vivid Picks. Hit the subscribe before you go, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one.